Rain lashed against the streaked windows of the small-town bus station, the kind of relentless downpour that seemed to mirror Daniel Reed's thoughts. He stood by the vending machine, jingling the last few coins in his pocket, debating whether to buy a cup of coffee or save the change for the week ahead. It was late, nearly 9 p.m., and the station was mostly empty except for a few weary travelers. Daniel had just finished a handyman job in a neighboring town and was waiting for the cheapest late-night bus back home. As he leaned against the wall, his eyes drifted to a young girl sitting on the far end of the bench. She couldn't have been more than 17. Her wet hair clung to her face, and she kept glancing at her phone with a look of growing panic. She was shivering, her thin jacket doing little against the cold draft that crept through the station. Daniel tried to look away, but something about her reminded him of his son, Max. If Max were ever in trouble, he'd hope someone would notice and step in. The girl's hands trembled as she pressed her phone to her ear. "Mom, I don't know what to do." Her voice cracked, loud enough for Daniel to hear. I don't have any money and my phone's about to die. I'm so sorry. I don't know how this happened." Her words hung in the air as she ended the call and buried her face in her hands. Daniel hesitated. He didn't want to pry, but the guilt of staying silent gnawed at him. Finally, he stepped forward, clearing his throat softly so as not to startle her. "Hey," he said gently, his voice warm but cautious. "You okay?" The girl looked up, startled, her eyes red and puffy. I'm fine," she stammered, trying to compose herself. But the way she clutched her phone and avoided his gaze told a different story. Daniel crouched slightly to meet her eyes. "You don't look fine. What's going on?" She hesitated before sighing deeply. "My wallet got stolen earlier today. I was visiting a friend in town, and now I'm stuck. I was supposed to take the earlier bus home, but..." Her voice broke. "I don't have any money for a ticket, and my phone's about to die. My parents live 2 hours away, and I don't even know if they can come get me tonight." For a moment, Daniel said nothing, his mind racing. He didn't have much himself, barely enough to keep the lights on at home. His son Max depended on him, and every dollar counted. Yet seeing the fear in her eyes, he couldn't just walk away. He thought of Max again, imagining his 10-year-old boy stranded somewhere, scared and helpless. If someone could help Max in that moment, wouldn't he want them to? "What's your name?" he asked finally. "Emily?" she replied softly. "Emily Carter." "Well, Emily, I'm Daniel," he said, offering a small smile. "Look, I don't have much, but I think I can help you out." Her eyes widened. "Really? You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," he interrupted gently, "but I want to." Daniel pulled out his wallet and counted the few bills he had left. It was just enough to cover her bus fare with a couple of dollars to spare. He hesitated for a split second, thinking about the groceries he still needed to buy that week, but the decision was already made. "Come on," he said, motioning for her to follow him to the ticket counter. Emily trailed behind, her voice barely above a whisper as she tried to protest. "You really don't have to do this," she said. "I'll figure something out. I can call my parents again." "It's okay," Daniel assured her. "Sometimes people just need a little help. You can pay it forward someday." The clerk at the counter raised an eyebrow as Daniel handed over the cash, but he didn't care. Emily stood beside him, clutching her phone and looking like she couldn't believe what was happening. When the clerk handed over the ticket, Daniel turned and placed it in her hands. "There," he said. "You're all set." Emily stared at the ticket, then at Daniel, her eyes welling up with tears. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't even know how to repay you." "You don't have to," Daniel said with a shrug. "Just get home safe, okay?" Before she could respond, the announcement for her bus echoed through the station. Emily glanced at the departure board, then back at Daniel. "Wait," she said quickly. What's your last name? My parents would want to know who helped me. He paused for a moment before answering. Reed. Daniel Reed. Emily nodded, pulling a small notebook from her bag and scribbling his name down. I'll never forget this, she said. Thank you so much. Daniel gave her a small wave as she hurried to board the bus. He watched through the rain-speckled window as she found a seat and glanced back at him one last time, mouthing the words, "Thank you." As the bus pulled away, Daniel felt a strange mix of emotions. The warmth of having helped someone in need was quickly overshadowed by the cold reality of his own situation. He checked his wallet again, just a few coins left. He sighed, stuffing it back into his pocket. The night bus back to his side of town arrived an hour later. By the time he got home, Max was already asleep, a half-finished drawing of a superhero, lying on the kitchen table. Daniel smiled faintly as he tucked his son in, but the weight of their financial struggles pressed heavily on his shoulders. Still, as he lay in bed that night, the image of Emily's relieved face stayed with him. He didn't regret his decision, not one bit. 2 weeks had passed since that rainy night at the bus station, and life for Daniel Reed had continued its usual uphill climb. The handyman work kept him busy, but the jobs were sporadic and didn't always pay well. The bills on the kitchen counter seemed to multiply each time he glanced at them, and the fridge was emptier than he liked. Still, Daniel carried on, doing his best to shield his 10-year-old son, Max, from the weight of their struggles. It was a Wednesday evening, and Daniel was sitting at the small kitchen table with Max. They were working on Max's homework together, though it was mostly Max explaining his elaborate superhero drawings while Daniel nodded along, trying to muster enthusiasm despite his exhaustion. And this one, Max said, holding up a heavily penciled sketch. He's called Lightning Strike. He can run faster than anyone, and no one can ever catch him. Daniel smiled faintly. I bet he's the fastest hero in the whole world. Max grinned, clearly proud of his creation. He is, and he always helps people. Like if someone's in trouble, he's there in a flash. Daniel ruffled his son's hair. Sounds like a good guy to have around. Just as Max launched into a detailed explanation of Lightning Strike's backstory, Daniel's phone buzzed on the table. The screen lit up with an unfamiliar number. Daniel hesitated, his first instinct to ignore it. Unknown numbers, usually, meant telemarketers or debt collectors, but something made him pick up the phone. Hello? He said cautiously. Is this Daniel Reed? A man's voice asked. It was polite but firm, with a slight edge of urgency. Yeah, Daniel replied, his brow furrowing. Who's this? This is Tom Carter. I'm Emily's father. Daniel blinked, caught off guard. Emily? Oh, Emily. The girl from the bus station? Yes, Tom said, his voice softening slightly. She told us what you did for her that night. I've been meaning to call you for days, but it took us a little time to track you down. I hope I'm not interrupting anything. Daniel glanced at Max, who was now doodling in his notebook, completely engrossed. No, it's fine. Is Emily okay? She's fine, Tom assured him quickly. She got home safe that night thanks to you. She told us everything. How you gave her your last bit of money for a ticket, even though you didn't have much yourself. My wife and I were, well, we were deeply moved. I just wanted to thank you personally. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair. It wasn't a big deal, he said, brushing it off. She needed help, and I was there. Anyone would have done the same. Not everyone would have, Tom countered firmly. Emily noticed a lot more than you might think. She told us how you hesitated before buying the ticket, how you counted your money carefully. She could tell you didn't have much to spare, but you helped her anyway. That kind of kindness isn't as common as you might believe. Daniel didn't know how to respond. He wasn't used to being praised, especially for something he considered so simple. I just did what felt right, he said quietly. Well, "We wanted to do something to thank you properly," Tom continued. "Would you be willing to meet with me and my wife? Maybe over lunch sometime? It would mean a lot to us." Daniel immediately shook his head, even though Tom couldn't see him. "That's really not necessary," he said. "I didn't do it expecting anything in return." "I know that," Tom said, his tone understanding but insistent. "But please, humor us. It would mean a great deal to my wife, Susan. Emily hasn't stopped talking about you, and we'd like to meet the man who helped our daughter when she needed it most." Daniel hesitated. He didn't like the idea of being fussed over, and the thought of sitting in a nice restaurant with people he didn't know made him uneasy. But there was something genuine in Tom's voice, a sincerity that made it hard to say no. I don't know," Daniel said slowly. "I'm not really sure what the point would be." "The point," Tom said firmly, "is gratitude. And who knows? Maybe it'll be worth your while." Daniel frowned at the cryptic comment. "I'll think about it," he said finally, hoping that would be enough to end the conversation. "Fair enough," Tom said. "I'll text you my number. If you decide to meet, just let me know. And thank you again, Daniel. You made a difference that night. Don't underestimate that." After the call ended, Daniel stared at his phone for a long moment. The conversation left him feeling unsettled, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. He had no intention of meeting the Carters. He didn't need their thanks, and he certainly didn't want their pity. Helping Emily had been the right thing to do, and that was enough for him. "Who was that?" Max asked, looking up from his drawing. "Just someone I helped out a while back," Daniel said, trying to sound casual. "They wanted to say thanks." "Did you save them, like a superhero?" Max asked eagerly. Daniel chuckled. "Not quite, but I guess I helped a little." Max beamed. "You're like lightning strike, helping people when they need it most." Daniel smiled faintly, though his mind was still on the phone call. He decided to push it aside for now. There were more pressing matters to deal with, like getting through the rest of the week without falling further behind on bills. But later that night, as he lay in bed staring at the cracked ceiling, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that the Carters weren't done with him yet. Another week passed before Daniel finally gave in and agreed to meet the Carters. Tom had followed up with a polite text message a few days after their phone conversation, reiterating his gratitude and leaving the details of the meeting entirely up to Daniel. At first, Daniel ignored the message, telling himself that he didn't need anything from them. But as the days wore on, he began to reconsider. Max had been sick with a cold that week, and Daniel had to take a day off work to stay home and care for him. The missed day meant one less paycheck, which meant more stress as he tried to decide which bill he could afford to delay this month. He hated the idea of being in anyone's debt, but he also couldn't ignore the gnawing curiosity about what Tom had meant by making it worth his while. So, reluctantly, Daniel typed out a short reply. "Okay, let's meet. You pick the time and place." Tom responded immediately, suggesting lunch at a small family-owned restaurant just outside of town. The place was modest, but well-regarded, which put Daniel slightly more at ease. He didn't want to walk into some fancy establishment where his worn boots and second-hand jacket would stick out like a sore thumb. The day of the meeting arrived, and Daniel found himself standing outside the restaurant, his stomach churning with nerves. He had dug out his best shirt, a faded blue button-down, and ironed it to the best of his ability. His jeans were clean, though they were starting to fray at the cuffs. As he caught his reflection in the window, he ran a hand through his hair, wishing he'd had time for a proper haircut. "Just get it over with," he muttered to himself before stepping inside. The Carters were easy to spot. Tom was a tall man in his mid-50s, with neatly combed silver hair and a sharp but friendly demeanor. His wife, Susan, was warm and approachable, her kind eyes lighting up the moment she saw Daniel. They both stood as he approached, extending their hands in greeting. "Daniel," It's so good to finally meet you, Tom said, his handshake firm, but not overbearing. Thank you for coming, Susan added, her voice gentle. We've been looking forward to this. Daniel nodded, feeling awkward under their gratitude. Thanks for inviting me. I don't usually do this kind of thing. But, well, here I am. They laughed lightly, sensing his discomfort, and quickly steered the conversation toward more casual topics as they sat down. The waitress came by to take their orders, and Daniel hesitated when it was his turn. The prices on the menu were reasonable, but still higher than what he was used to. Get whatever you'd like, Tom said, noticing Daniel's hesitation. It's on us, Daniel nodded, ordering the cheapest sandwich on the menu, despite Tom's reassurance. As they waited for their food, the Carters began asking questions about his life. They weren't pushy, but their curiosity was genuine, and slowly, Daniel found himself opening up. He told them about Max, about losing his wife to cancer 5 years ago, and about the constant struggle to make ends meet as a single dad. It's not easy, he admitted, his voice low. But Max is a good kid. He makes it all worth it. Susan reached across the table, placing a hand lightly on his arm. You're doing an incredible job, Daniel. Emily told us how kind you were to her, even when you didn't have much to give. That says a lot about the kind of person you are. Daniel looked down, feeling a mix of pride and embarrassment. I just did what anyone would do, he said. Not anyone, Tom said firmly. What you did for Emily went above and beyond, and it's not something we take lightly. Their food arrived then, and the conversation shifted to lighter topics for a while. Daniel found himself relaxing, though. He still felt a little out of place. The Carters were clearly well off, their polished appearances and easy confidence a stark contrast to his own rough edges. But they never made him feel lesser, and for that, he was grateful. As the meal wound down, Tom reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a plain white envelope. He slid it across the table toward Daniel. What's this? Daniel asked, eyeing it warily. A thank you, Tom said simply. Please open it. Daniel hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to refuse, but under Tom and Susan's expectant gazes, he reluctantly picked up the envelope and opened it. Inside was a check made out to him for $7,500. His breath caught. I can't accept this, he stammered, immediately pushing the envelope back across the table. Daniel, Susan said gently, this isn't charity. It's a gesture of gratitude. You helped our daughter when she was scared and vulnerable. You didn't have to, but you did. Please, let us do this for you. Tom leaned forward, his expression earnest. We know you're a proud man, and we respect that. But we also know how hard you're working to provide for your son. Think of this as an investment in your family's future. Daniel shook his head, his emotions a whirlwind of gratitude, pride, and discomfort. It's too much, he said quietly. It's not, Tom insisted. And there's more. I own a few properties around town, and one of them could really use a good handyman. It's part-time work, flexible hours. If you're interested, the job is yours. Daniel stared at them, overwhelmed. The check alone was enough to catch up on bills, fix the leaky roof, and maybe even put a little aside for Max's future. And the job offer. That could be the stability he'd been praying for. But still, he hesitated. Why are you doing this? He asked finally. Tom's gaze softened. Because you didn't hesitate to help my daughter when she needed it most. And because the world needs more people like you, Daniel. Let us help you the way you helped her. For a long moment, Daniel said nothing. Then, slowly, he nodded. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know how to repay you for this. You already did, Susan said with a smile. As Daniel left the restaurant that day, the envelope tucked carefully into his jacket, he felt a weight lifting off his shoulders. For the first time in years, the future didn't feel so daunting. It felt, for the first time in a long time, like hope. It had been a month since the lunch with the Carters, and Daniel's life had started to feel lighter in ways he hadn't imagined possible. The $7,500 check had brought a wave of relief that was still settling over him. He'd used the money carefully, paying off the most pressing bills first: 2 months of overdue rent, the electricity bill that had been haunting him, and the hefty balance on his late wife's medical expenses. There was even enough left over to fix the leaky roof that had been dripping into Max's bedroom every time it rained. The part-time handyman job Tom had offered turned out to be a blessing in disguise. It was steady work, something Daniel hadn't had in years, and the hours were flexible enough that he could still be there for Max. The job mostly involved basic repairs and maintenance at the apartment complex Tom owned on the nicer side of town. The tenants were friendly, the work wasn't overwhelming, and for the first time in years, Daniel felt like he could breathe. On this particular Saturday morning, Max was sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, surrounded by crayons and paper. He was sketching yet another superhero, his tongue poking out slightly in concentration. Daniel sat nearby, sipping a cup of coffee he'd finally been able to splurge on after weeks of drinking the cheapest instant stuff he could find. "Check this out, Dad." Max held up his latest drawing, an energetic swirl of color that depicted a caped figure holding a wrench in one hand and a hammer in the other. "This is Handyman. He fixes everything and saves people in trouble." Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. "Handyman, huh? Sounds like he's got a busy schedule." Max grinned. "Yep, but he's super strong and super fast, so he can handle it, kind of like you." He paused, as if the thought had just occurred to him. "You're like Handyman, Dad. You always fix stuff." Daniel's chest tightened at his son's innocent praise. "Well, someone's got to keep things running around here," he said lightly, trying to mask the emotion in his voice. "But I think I've got a long way to go before I'm a superhero." Max shrugged, unfazed. "You're my superhero." Before Daniel could respond, there was a knock at the door. He frowned slightly. He wasn't expecting anyone. Max scrambled to his feet, racing to answer it before Daniel could stop him. "Hold on, Max," Daniel called, setting his mug down and following close behind. When Max opened the door, Emily Carter stood on the porch, a shy smile on her face. She was holding a small, neatly wrapped box. Her parents, Tom and Susan, were standing a few steps behind her, their hands tucked into their coat pockets against the crisp autumn breeze. Daniel blinked in surprise. "Emily, Tom, Susan, what are you all doing here?" Tom stepped forward, his expression warm. "We were in the area and thought we'd stop by to say hello. Emily's been wanting to see you and Max." Emily nodded, holding out the box. "This is for you, Max. I made it myself." Max took the box eagerly, tearing off the paper to reveal a hand-drawn comic book. The cover featured Handyman and Lightning Strike teaming up to save the day, and the pages inside were filled with colorful illustrations of their adventures. "Whoa," Max said, flipping through the pages with wide eyes. "This is so cool. You drew all this?" Emily nodded, her cheeks flushing. "Yeah. I remembered you liked superheroes, so I thought you might like it." "I love it," Max said, grinning from ear to ear. "Thank you." Daniel looked at Emily, his voice soft. "That's really thoughtful of you, thank you." "It's the least I could do," Emily said, glancing at her parents. "You helped me when I really needed it, and now my family is helping you. It's like a circle, you know?" Daniel smiled faintly, nodding. "Yeah, I guess it is. Tom." Cleared his throat, stepping forward. "We won't keep you long, but we wanted to check in and see how things are going." Daniel hesitated for a moment, then gestured for them to come inside. "You're welcome to stay for a bit," he said. "Max, why don't you show Emily your drawings while I talk with Mr. and Mrs. Carter?" Max grabbed Emily's hand, leading her to the living room. "Come on, I'll show you Handyman and all my other superheroes." As the kids disappeared into the other room, Daniel turned to Tom and Susan, his expression more serious. "I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done. The money, the job, it's made such a difference. I can finally sleep at night without worrying about how to keep the lights on." Susan smiled, her eyes kind. "You don't need to thank us, Daniel. We're just glad we could help." Tom nodded. "You've more than earned it. From everything Emily told us, it's clear you're a good man. We're just happy to see you and Max doing well." Daniel ran a hand through his hair, his voice quiet. "It's not just the money or the job. It's knowing that someone sees me, that someone cares. That's what means the most." Susan placed a hand on his arm, her touch gentle. "We all need a little help sometimes, Daniel. There's no shame in accepting kindness when it's offered." Daniel nodded, his throat tight. "Well, it's made a big difference. Not just for me, but for Max, too. He's been so happy these past few weeks. He loves hearing about Handyman and Lightning Strike teaming up." Tom chuckled. "Sounds like you've got a budding storyteller on your hands." Daniel smiled faintly. "Yeah, he's got a big imagination." After a while, the Carters said their goodbyes, leaving Daniel and Max alone once again. As Daniel watched Max curl up on the couch with Emily's comic book, his face glowing with excitement, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. Life wasn't perfect. There were still challenges ahead, still bills to pay and repairs to make. But for the first time in years, Daniel felt like he wasn't carrying the weight of the world alone. He had a steady job, a roof that didn't leak, and a son who thought he was a superhero